Okay, just a quick walk around. This is my table saw here in my shop. It's not an expensive one. In fact, I picked up this table saw for I think it was $100 that I bought this off some guy. It's a General Mechanic 10-inch table saw, 2 horsepower, 110 volt. And I put this extension table on it with this fence. I have my router here, and that's underneath. And then I have this Shopsmith dust collector, and it's connected down there. Okay, so that's basically it. Now, this is actually my third table saw. I had 2 Craftsman that were similar. One was a worm drive saw and the other was a belt drive saw. The worm drive bit a big one, and then the other belt drive Craftsman bearings were going out on it. So I picked this up before the bearings went out, and then just switched them out once the bearings went out. So this is the throw plate. There's inside the table saw. It just has a standard blade on it right now. Now, these throw plates I made. It's what they call a zero kerth, because it's just basically the width of the blade. Now, this saw came with, let's see here, came with this. Now, the problem with this is that when you're cutting material that is, thin enough to fall inside there, you're gonna have that problem, and it could cause all kinds of havoc. It's okay if you're cutting wider material, but when you're doing this, or even you can use this to cut 45s or beveled cuts. But if you're just cutting material, and I do a lot of cutting of smaller material, I want a zero kerf throw plate on it. Now, this particular one has this splitter, which is pretty basic. It's just a piece of plexiglass cut into that, and then I used a 2-part epoxy to put that together. Now, the other thing that you probably noticed is that in order to get this to where it's flush and I don't have any problems on the back end with it getting cut, I just used some hot glue to raise it up to where it's not going to give me any issues as far as the material getting stuck in there or otherwise. Now, this one has a splitter. A lot of times I'm not going to use a splitter because of what I'm cutting. If it's small enough material and it's not going to need a splitter, then I'll put this one in. And again, I don't like having the wideness of that. Too many things can go wrong when you're working on a table saw. I just don't like it. Okay. And that's basically it. As far as the demo, well, right here, there's an on and off switch, which I got connected to this on and off switch here. It just makes it easier and safer for me to turn this off instead of having to come down here and hit this button and turn this off that way. Okay, this raises and lowers the blade. You can see that going on right there. And then this one on this side, that tilts it so you can cut 45-degree angles. Okay. This fence right here attaches to it, and I've attached this fence to all three of my table saws. It's just pretty basic. There's a lot of the holes are kind of universal, and if you're switching out a table saw, you do it that way. Okay, this knob comes up and this slides back and forth. Okay, it has a gauge there, and I've had to adjust this gauge and get a new measuring tape for it, and make sure that it's right at where it should be, so my numbers are right. And then to lock it down, this knob just comes down, and then that locks it down. Okay, now you have to remember that there is no guard on this blade on top, so there's some things you have to be careful about, and we'll get into that once we get on into safety. So that's about it. I do have a box sled. I'll work on that, and it'll probably be part of this video also, and then the miter gauge, and I'll do some cuts on the miter gauge and with the box sled also, so you guys can see those. Okay, so one of the first things that I tell my students when they're operating the table saw is, get a piece of scrap wood here for a second. Okay, so a couple things you have to be aware of. And first of all, any material that you get, depending on what it is, it's not going to be perfectly straight. So it's going to wobble on your table. And that's just something you have to deal with when it comes to the material you're working with, or you can run it through a planer to get it to where it's flat. The other thing is that when you're cutting material that has knots in it, you could go through your cut, and then that knot starts to wiggle and fly out, and it can come back and hit you. So you want to be very careful. And I've seen some guys, they'll glue these knots in with CA glue or something, so that it's not going to come loose or fly at you when you're making a cut. But there's always that possibility, so you got to be careful when you're cutting material and it's got knots on it. Also, the reason you need a splitter, you can see the splitter on this right here. Okay, the reason you need that is because as you're cutting this piece of material, what's going to happen is I start this cut, and then all of a sudden, because the tension on the grain of the wood, it starts to bind or pinch into itself, and that's going to cause you to get either kickback or cause the motor to just shut down on you, and you'll have to stop the motor as quick as you can. And that's one of the reasons why I have my on and off switch here, so that I don't have to reach down here in order to turn it off and get my face in the way of what's going on when I'm cutting. The other thing that I tell my students all the time is this. If I'm cutting a piece of material, I don't want to stand directly in line with the outfeed of what I'm cutting, because you never know what can happen. Things can move, and you can get a binding, and all of a sudden you got this piece of material flying back and hitting you. Now, and I'm telling you this from experience, I've cut very small pieces of wood on a table saw, and I'm going and I'm pushing, and all of a sudden my push stick slips off. That gets to bind in between the blade and the fence, and it shoots it out. And it shoots it out very, very fast, and it can be very painful and even dangerous. So I tell my students always, never stand in line with the outfeed or directly behind the blade, because anything can happen. So as a rule, I want to stand off to this side, so that whatever's going on here, if something happens and that thing's going to fly that way, I'm not going to get hit by it. It's going to fly out that way. So always stand to the left side of the blade, clear from the direction of where the blade is. And if you got kicked back, it would fly that way instead of hitting you in the side. Never stand directly in front. Okay? That's a big no-no when you're working with a table saw. And I've seen a lot of guys do it. They'll stand right here and they'll be cutting all day, and you never know what's going to happen. It can happen where that thing all of a sudden gets bind up in there at the end, and you're going to get hit with that stock that's sitting in there. Okay, not a good thing. It can be quite painful and quite dangerous. So, just for the sake of showing you, I'm going to go ahead and make a cut. But the other thing that I don't want to do is I don't want this blade to be sticking up way up above my stock. So I've seen people do this, and that blade is way up above where it needs to be. It's just dangerous. Anytime you have that blade exposed, you know, there's a lot more blade there for you to get tangled up in if you do something wrong. Now, go back to our number one rule in the shop, and it should be your number one rule in your home shop or any shop. And I used to tell my students this all the time: never, ever look away. When you have a saw running, you should never turn your head and be distracted by anything. You need to stay focused on what you're doing, where your hands are in your cut, because you don't want to look away and all of a sudden get your hand into the blade. And that's how people get injured. Most of the time, you know, it's either a guy who has a lot of experience and he just gets comfortable and relaxed, and he's not thinking about what he's doing, and then he'll make a mistake. And then, you know, if you have an old saw like this, it's not like a stop saw where that blade is going to disappear if you get anywhere near it. No, that blade's going to continue to go, and it's going to cut whatever comes in its path. So you want to be totally focused. And again, the number one shop rule is never, ever look away when you're operating a power tool and that power tool is on. You want to stay focused, keep your eyes on where you're at. You don't want to turn away from it for any reason, okay? And for me, I'm always going to stand away from the path of that blade, away from anything that's going to be able to come back and hit me, okay? So, first thing you're going to do is you're going to take and lower that saw. And I like to just say, I'm going to have just the teeth showing, barely have the teeth showing. I'm not going to go any higher than that. And if you go higher than that, you're going to run into problems. Okay? So, I'm going to show you that type of cut. I'm going to make a small cut on here. Okay? If I was cutting this piece of material and it was wider than 6 inches, okay, I can push it through with my hand, right? But if it's smaller than 6 inches, then I'm going to use a push stick. So I'm going to start by just cutting a small piece off of this so you can see what I'm doing. So as I make this cut, I'm going to push this material in that direction to ensure that it stays right to the fence. If I push the material this way and it comes away from the fence, right here it comes away from the fence, I'm going to run into all kinds of problems. So I want to make sure that it stays tight to the fence, and I push it that way, in an angle that way. The other thing that's important to remember is you see how long it took for that blade to stop. I never want to assume, especially if your shop is noisy, I've got the dust collector going and it makes a lot of noise, and sometimes, you know, it's hard to hear and you don't know if that blade's running, and then you have a piece of material. You never want to reach in to remove anything from close to the blade until that blade comes to a complete stop. And that's really important, because you can really get injured with this saw. So wait till the saw comes to a complete stop before you reach in and you touch anything inside there, because you don't want something to happen, okay? All right, so now I'm going to cut a smaller piece. It's smaller than 6 inches. I'm going to use a push stick. This is where you can get something flying back to you if you don't push the material all the way through past the blade. Okay, if you just push it this far and think you're safe, you're going to run into problems. That's going to, with the vibration of the blade turning, it can get caught in between the blade and the fence and the blade, and then kick it out back that way. So you always want to push past the blade when you're cutting a piece of material. You never want to leave that material in between the blade and the fence, because a lot can happen there. All right, I'm going to make that cut. Make sure you put your push stick where you can get it, someplace where you can reach. Always stand to the left side of the blade, leaving this area free. Start with your hands, hold it, grab your push stick, take your left hand away, and just finish with your push stick. Push all the way through the blade. Do not reach in for that. Watch and make sure that the blade has come to a complete stop before you reach in. Now, these are just basic safety things that you have to be aware of when you're cutting with this. There's so much more that is involved when you get into dado cuts and rabbit cuts and all kinds of other things, but this is just basic. The other thing that happens a lot, and people don't realize this either. If I'm cutting this piece of material, the part that I'm cutting, and this could be a piece of ply, I'm just using this scrap piece just to show you. The part that I'm cutting is this wide, and the part that I'm pushing is wider. So I tell my students, never try to cut a piece of material unless you're using the T-square by hand, even with the push stick. If it's like this, it's even worse, because what happens is I'm pushing and I've got more leverage over here, and it's very easy for me to push it just a little bit wrong, and then I got a gap going, and this thing is going to grab it and toss it towards me. So I never want to cut a piece of material that is wider than it is long this way. Okay, I want to make sure that whatever I'm cutting, right, I'm either using the T-square that goes with the saw, or I'm using a box saw, or I'm cutting it over on the miter saw. I don't want to make this kind of cut on this saw. You can do it, and I've seen lots of people online do it, but it is really dangerous. So I want to make sure that if I'm cutting a piece of material, it's a rip cut. I can do a cross cut with a T-square or a cross cut with a box saw. If I'm going to do a cross cut, more than likely I'm going to go over to my miter saw and do it there, or I'm going to use a box saw, which is a lot safer, a sliding box, if you will. All right, so I'm going to make a smaller cut and cut with a push stick. You never want to start also with the blade, with your material next to the blade where the blade can catch on your material. You always want to start farther back, right? So you're nowhere near the blade when you start, and you're always pushing in that direction when you start your cut also. Make sure your push stick is nearby where you can grab onto it. Once you get it started, grab the push stick. Once it gets to a point where my hands are getting close to the blade, I'm going to take my left hand away and finish my cut. Push all the way through. Turn the saw off. Wait till the saw comes to a complete stop before I reach in there. Now I can reach in there and pull away my stop. Okay? Pretty basic. This saw is to be respected. You don't want to take it lightly. You always want to be aware that the blade is turning and that it will cut you. Okay.